Let's talk about Ralph Capone for a minute. That would be Al's older brother. He was born, to my surprise, in Italy. I didn't know that. He was born Raphael James Capone in 1894. He died heavily, heavily in debt to the federal government on November 22, 1974. He was born in Angria, Angri, Italy. It's a very small town near Mount Vesuvius. That's interesting. The middle of 8 children. He was Al's older brother, as I think I just said. He arrived in America on June 18th, 1895, with his older brother Vincenzo and their mother Teresa through Ellis Island. The father had come into the U.S. from Canada 6 months before. I'm surprised at the way that he wasn't. The U.S. federal government didn't try to deport him by finding a loophole in how he came into the U.S. Deportations, although it sounds ominous, they're not very successful all the time. It's a long, long process. But I think in his case, the federal government would have done it just to be nasty. They wrecked this guy after he had gone to prison for tax evasion. They hounded him until the day he died. So I'm a little surprised they didn't pull that out of their hat. But anyway, the family settled in Brooklyn near the Navy Yards, or what had been the Navy Yards. The house is still there, by the way. You can drive by and see it. It's a little white thing. On September 24, 1915, at 21, he married Filomena Moscato. She was 17. She called herself Florence. They had a son, Ralph Gabriel Capone, in 1917. They were divorced because Florence abandoned the marriage. In 1923, he married Vilma Pheasant. What a name, Vilma Pheasant. They had no children, and they were divorced in 1938. He married again in 1958 to his to his longtime girlfriend, Madeline. Ralph was called to Chicago. Ralph Sr. was called to Chicago in 1920. He took his son Ralph Jr. with him. He would be raised by Ralph's mother, the boy's grandmother. In 1950, Ralph Jr., the little boy, was now 33 years old. He was found dead in his apartment at 7312 Jeffrey Avenue from the effects of long-term alcoholism. As I say, he was only 33 years old. What a shame. For a while, his life had been on the straight and narrow. He played football for Notre Dame, and he was pretty damn good, too. He later graduated from DePaul University. He was married to a beautiful woman, Elizabeth. They had 2 children, but he drank, and she left him with the kids. In 1960, his divorced wife, Elizabeth, was granted a name change in Superior Court for herself and their son, Ralph Dennis Capone. This would be Ralph, third, right? And then he was then 17, the boy was 17, and the last name was changed to simply Gabriel, his father's middle name, Ralph Gabriel. The mother thought he can't go through his life being known as Ralph Capone. It's just more punishment than he deserved. Back in 1920, anyway, once he was in Chicago, Ralph Sr. was placed in charge of the outfit's bottling plants. They owned 1 or 2, but almost all of that was done outhouse. They contracted it to firms that were already in business. Anyway, he was instrumental in trying to monopolize the outfit's hold on non-alcoholic drinks, sodas, and eventually caused him to become known in the press anyway as Bottles. So they loved ginger ale, which was really popular at the time, so they had a lead on that. He made a fortune for the outfit as the dominant soft drink vendor, probably the only soft drink vendor, outside of Coca-Cola at the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. I think that is inaccurate. I think it's the World's Exhibition, wasn't it? Cermak, the mayor of Chicago, who was as bad as any gangster, had that World's Fair in Chicago to try to clean up the image of the place. After Al was imprisoned in 1931, Ralph continued on in organized crime. He dabbled in gambling, prostitution. He also ran his infamous Cotton Club at 5342 West 22nd Street in Cicero. The building still stands today. It's a drugstore. He also ran the Man Marti nightclub. The mayor of Chicago, Big Bill Thompson, a former mayor, was especially fond of his clubs, of the Cotton Club, and he was there a lot. The place went on untouched. It was a big, huge hit for him. The club, oddly enough, had no color barrier as far as entertainment was concerned. So all the top acts of the 1920 Black Acts, the 1920s played there. I'll bet for a wide audience, but still. In the early 1930s, both clubs were raided virtually every week. The manager at the time was this guy, Michael Allegretti. I don't know if he's related to Monk Allegretti, who at one point was a fugitive from justice, and federal agents found him holed up at the Metropole Hotel in downtown Chicago with a 19-year-old girlfriend named Betty. Allegretti pleaded to the agents not to mention the girl in the arrest report because the newspapers would pick it up, and he said, if you do that, my wife is Irish, she'll kill me. Starting in the late 1920s, Ralph became a high target in the eyes of what was becoming the increasingly powerful federal law enforcement apparatus. The federal government prior to Prohibition, it was not as we know it today. In other words, they got in their own way more than anything else. But by the end of the 1920s, early 30s, they had their act together, and the federal government law enforcement apparatus, and it was dangerous. In 1935, the gangster Louis Altieri was forced to testify against Ralph on a tax evasion charge. This is after he had just been hit in 32 with a tax charge. So before he could testify, of course, Altieri ended up shot to pieces. There's I don't want to imply here that they did it so he couldn't testify against Ralph. They did it because he was just generally a loon, Altieri, and he was a pain in the ass, and he was running wild, trying to take over unions that didn't belong to him. I mean, he signed his own death warrant. He had left Chicago and came back. And coming back is what killed him. They told him not to. Virgil Peterson, who was the director of the Chicago Crime Commission and probably one of the finest Americans who ever lived. The guy was fearless. He had great principle. He fought the mob alone. He appeared before the Kefauver Committee, and he said Ralph is not retired, as he's telling you. He's very active in the National Syndicate of Crime, which made Ralph even more of a target for the federal government. I don't know how much of a power he was in the National Syndicate. I guess it'd be not much. If you're a gangster trying to do things on the quiet, do you really want somebody named Capone running around with you? So I think he may have been effective in Chicago, but not beyond its borders. In the late 1950s, Ralph moved to Mercer, Wisconsin, to a home he had bought in the early 1930s. Once there, he operated a hotel/tavern called the Rex Hotel, and the tavern was named Billy's Bar. He died there on November 22, 1974, of natural causes in a nursing home in Hurley, Wisconsin. His whole life, the latter part of his life, from 1930 onward, was a constant mess with the IRS. They were absolutely convinced he had salted away millions and millions. Maybe he did, I don't know. But they were absolutely convinced. And they came in, they took his watches as an example, his telephone, just crazy things. So the last part of his life was fairly miserable. I do know that for a while, and this might be after he got out of prison for his first term, they were watching to put him back in prison on anything, any parole violation. So he sold linoleum was really popular in those days. It was like a flooring, in other words. He sold that, and I knew the woman who hired him for that. But otherwise, we don't hear much about Ralph, do we?